A Liberty Seguros agora é Yellow. Tudo aquilo que já era bom continua igual. Excelência e proximidade permanecem como nossa essência. Porque não é uma mudança, é uma evolução. A Yellow está sempre em sintonia com você. É liberdade com segurança. A melhor experiência acessível a todos os clientes, iluminando cada passo da sua jornada. Deixe essa luz iluminar seu caminho. Yellow Seguradora. Seguro para viver livre. Consulte seu corretor.
When I watched what they were doing and how they were destroying this country at the border, I mean, millions and millions of people, I'm sure we have some in here tonight with us, you know, murderers and drug dealers, prisoners, you know, they have prisons from all over the world are being emptied out into our country, all over the world, the Congo and Africa.
Hello and welcome to Quiet Riot Sunday School, the fine wine flight that accompanies the full Thursday feast. I'm Alex Andreou.
And I'm Naomi Smith, and we're recording this on Saturday, or Badenoch Day, as it must now be known. I cannot stress enough how moved I have felt this week to see a woman Chancellor give the first budget by a woman in the UK, and now a black Nigerian woman as leader of the opposition. Whether you agree with either or not, it is surely a momentous week in British politics.
Hear, hear. Now, this week was payday, so if you can cross our palms with a bit of silver, we'd be very, very grateful. It does cost sweat and tears and cash to stare into the Quiet Riot crystal ball and predict political fortunes, which we do happily.
So please head over to Ko-Fi, that's ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod to sign up as a monthly supporter, and in return you'll get invites to editorial meetings, you'll get access to our private Discord channel to chat away with other Quiet Rioters as well as Alex, Kenny and I, and you'll also be getting early notice of live shows in 2025.
Now, if you caught our main show on Thursday, you'll know we did a sort of instant budget reaction with the brilliant economist Vicky Pryce. Honestly, it still shocks me that these people don't just hang up the phone at us, let alone be guests. But we've had a bit of time to let things percolate since, so we're going to reflect on the budget now that some days have passed.
And of course, we are going to be talking lotto leanings now that Badenoch has won the Tory leadership race. But we'll also be using today as a therapy session to talk through our not insignificant anxieties about the US presidential election, which is entering its last 72 hours. Alex, first up, though, let's go with our headline, that is the new Conservative leader. What were your initial reactions when you heard that Kemi had won?
I mean, it was largely expected. She had been the favourite for quite a while, and all eyes were on turnout and the difference between the two. And in the end, 131,000 eligible voters, 53,000 or 56% went to Badenoch, 41,000 or 44% went to Jenrick. Now, it's worth saying that Sunak lost the last leadership election with 60,000 votes.
I was going to ask, what have today's numbers compared with previous election numbers told us about the state of the party?
It tells us that both the membership has shrunk by a huge amount. The total number of eligible voters last time round was 172,000, and it's now 131,000. I mean, that is a massive reduction. But also the turnout was lower. So last time it was 83%. This time it's 73%. So that means a couple of things. It means, first of all, on the raw numbers, Kemi Badenoch has been elected without a majority of party members behind her. You could say maybe that's because both candidates were so far on the right that actually the 90-odd thousand that voted for both of them are effectively from the same wing of the party will switch quite happily from Jenrick to Badenoch and vice versa if the reverse had happened. But it's also a really narrow result.
It's the closest ever result.
Just a smidgen closer than Truss and Sunak. But even that was the closest result by a long, long way at the time, because usually it goes more like 70-30, to be honest.
Indeed. And remember, she only got 42 of the MPs backing her in that final round of parliamentary votes at all. And I think did Jenrick get 41 in that last round of voting. So neither of them went in with the majority of the parliamentary party backing them either. So it's a close result on a low turnout of a dwindling membership of what we can now, prove is a very divided party.
Yeah, it seems to me it's not a sort of coincidence, those three factions, as it were, because also James Cleverly got roughly the same number of votes in that final round among MPs. And it seems to me that if you look at this result, 50-odd thousand to Badenoch, 40-odd thousand to Jenrick, and then 40-odd thousand again didn't vote. Maybe vote? That's the Cleverly contingent.
Did you vote, Alan?
I'm not going to...
No, you don't have to tell us who you voted for, but did you vote?
No, because I'm not going to say either if I didn't vote. I have my own strategic reasons and I shall never reveal what I did. But I will, if you wish, cut up my membership card. I've already
live on air.
I've already cancelled my direct debit, but I will cut up my membership card at the end of the show if you so wish it.
Atone for your sins.
Hello, Quiet Rioters. This is Salma Shah. So despite myself, I felt quite excited about that moment, having been sort of underwhelmed by the campaign more generally. So what I think is really exciting about this moment is we have a black woman who is in charge of the Conservative Party, and that's very sort of comforting in many ways, because there isn't a barrier in politics, based on your identity. And I'm sure Kemi would discourage people from sort of applauding that too much, given where she is on identity politics. But I think that's a moment to recognise. I think on the practicalities, it was actually a lot closer than we might have expected it to be. And so she is going to have to think about, the response of the membership and actually what they were saying around some of the policy objectives that Robert Jenrick may have set out on his campaign and sort of respond to that. I think her job now, given that she's been quite light on policy and has really been about the vibes throughout the campaign, is to start putting the flesh on the bones of what Kemi Badenoch Conservative Party is going to look like. I am actually genuinely excited about what Kemi versus Keir PMQs is going to look like. So, that's kind of like an initial reaction from the Tory leadership campaign, which, as I say, despite myself, I found quite exciting.
But this is a party that quite clearly can't agree on much, as has been the case for the party now for a long time. Certainly since Boris Johnson left the stage. And because they couldn't agree on much, they didn't do much. And that was partly what led to their destruction, really, at the general election back in July. So Kemi now finds herself in a situation where she needs to try and unite the party, keep them together. But she does also need to offer the electorate more. So she might be able to hold the party together by not spooking any one faction of it. And that was certainly pitch during her campaign. She swerved away from making any very bold policy announcements very, very purposefully in order to sort of keep that unity of vote behind her. But she will need to offer the electorate something. And I'm not sure these numbers give her the political capital to do that. Her pitch was Renewal 2030, not Kemi for leader.
Did you see her speech? It was very short.
It was.
And it was quite
I thought it was quite good.
punchy.
I thought it was
like
quite
she said, last government let standards slip, which will already put a few people's nose out of joint. Certainly Johnson's.
Our party is critical to the success of our country. But to be heard, we have to be honest. honest about the fact that we made mistakes, honest about the fact that we let standards slip. The time has come to tell the truth.
What I find interesting, I think, is that maybe, and obviously there's not enough information to say this definitively at the moment, but maybe whereas before the fracturing was fundamentally between right-wing Tory MPs and One Nation Tory MPs, there's now a three-way fracturing where you have the One Nation rump is now a third of the party, both membership and MPs. And then there's another third that's very right-wing, but very hostile to reform, that's also reflected in the membership. And then there's a third that's very right-wing, but wants to cozy up to reform, which was the sort of generic position. And I wonder if that's going to be quite a significant feature going forward.
Have we heard from Farage yet, or any of the reform lot, on the Badenoch news?
Let me check.
We know that she wasn't particularly popular with Reform UK voters from polling, and that Generic was more,
I wonder why,
their flavour, and one can draw their own conclusions about why. But it will be...
Yes, there has been a response, actually.
Okay, let us know.
He's put out a video saying Kemi Badenoch will make no difference as leader of the Conservative Party. They have broken the trust of the British people and the brand is broken.
Do we think he recorded two versions that said exactly the same thing, bar the word Generic?
Of course.
Kemi Badenoch is the leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition, which means the Conservative Party have turned their backs on the idea of leaving the ECHR because that's what Generic stood for. What you're going to get with Kemi Badenoch is more of the same as the last 14 years. The Conservative brand is broken.
There was a poll today, obviously an outlier because the aggregate is nowhere near that put the Tories ahead of Labour for the first time, I think, in 3 years. On Sky News, Sam Coates was creaming his knickers, continuing to bring a sort of fishwife aesthetic to the news. But,
and there was, and just for the benefit of listeners, this poll was taken immediately post-budget, was it? I think the field dates were 31st
that's right.
of October. Yeah.
I think it would have been easier for either Badenoch or Generic to take over with the polls very far apart, because then they can show improvement, because actually it gives them a little bit of space to maybe say some unpopular things, to maybe do some unpopular things, to try stuff out. With the polls actually getting much closer together, there's going to be this really false sense that somehow the Conservatives can reverse a huge majority that Labour won at the last election. And there will be a different kind of pressure on the new leader to tool them up for an election that they could possibly win, even though I don't think they can. And especially for Badenoch, because I think her plan was to come in and break a few things and do a lot of reforming. And I think if she does that, and that poll lead ends up vanishing, then there will be grumbling straight away that people have not taken to her, you know.
My WhatsApps immediately were filled with my political adjacent friends. You know, they're not political in terms of their day job, but they have an intellectual curiosity, and I'm their go-to person when they want to know the answer to something. Yeah. And almost all of them, their initial question was, how long do you give her? And, you know, these are generally sort of centrist-y, progressive-leaning people, assuming that she is too far to the right to garner sufficient electoral support across the country. And we talked about this right from the off, that whoever wins, are they highly likely to be an Ian Duncan Smith figure who is not the leader of the opposition for more than a couple of years before the men in grey suits come and tap them on the shoulder and say, you must move aside because we need somebody further to the centre ground that can mop up the wider coalition of votes that we've got to go after. And remember how many seats they lost to the Liberal Democrats at the election just gone. So they do need to build that broad coalition back. So, you know, there is that. And there was the poll that we talked about a couple of weeks ago of Conservative councillors. So these aren't just members, they're not just the laity, they are Conservatives who hold an elected position. a publicly elected position, and the majority of them didn't expect either Jenrick or Badenoch to be leader at the next election.
Yeah.
Tells you an awful lot. She will know all of this. She is very, very smart.
She's smart. I think she's smarter and smoother than people give her credit for. I think she will position the party more centristly than many expect. That would be my guess. But I think her fundamental problem, and it is a fundamental problem, is that it would have been the case for Jenrick anyway, but she is associated with previous governments. She has a record. She has things that she has said. She has policies that she has implemented. She can't completely pretend that she was born yesterday. And everyone she appoints to that shadow cabinet will have that kind of record, or a lot of them will, because actually, as a group of MPs, the Conservatives, there's so few of them.
Yep.
About half of them will get to shadow someone opposite. I have heard some gossip that she might be thinking of Andrew Griffith as Shadow Chancellor.
For listeners unfamiliar, give us a flavour of Griffith.
Well, he was on BBC Question Time last Thursday. He's a sort of bold chap, mild-mannered, safe pair of hands, quite economically literate, not a loon, all the right things, okay? But he was director of the policy unit in the last year of Johnson, which was a disaster. And he was economic secretary to the Treasury under Truss.
Ooh.
I mean, the attack lines for Reeves are almost pre-written.
Yeah.
And I think she will find that problem again and again, because people may put the Conservatives ahead in one single poll in the abstract, not knowing who will be leader, not knowing what the party's direction will be, not knowing what the policies will be, what the shadow cabinet will be. But once actually you begin to articulate values, policies, and you begin to appoint people in post, I think that's kind of the high watermark for them, because the moment there's people there in place, they have a record that can be attacked.
Indeed.
Hello, Quiet Writers. Henry Hill here, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home. Kemi's biggest problem is going to be reconciling the promise of unity with which she led her campaign, and which formed the basis for its relative lack of detail on policy or even diagnosis of what went wrong at the general election and before, with the need to have that very inevitably painful reckoning with the 2024 defeat, and indeed the fact that over the past 14 years, with the possible exception of Brexit, the Conservatives achieved relatively little of what they set out to in terms of either reducing immigration or cutting taxes. It's, in a way, similar to the way that Sir Keir Starmer won the general election by having nothing in his manifesto. The lack of specificity definitely had an electoral advantage. It didn't frighten the horses, but he won a big majority. But that majority doesn't have a mandate for very difficult policy decisions, either from the public, who, unlike in 2010, have not been warned in advance of anything resembling an austerity agenda, but also, crucially, from his MPs, who don't feel they've committed to anything. And I think Kemi is going to end up in the same boat. A lot of the people who were supporting her are praising her decision to focus on principles, not policies, but right up until its dying day, the last Conservative government had no problem testifying to its theoretical principles, to the smaller state and lower taxes and lower immigration and all the rest of it. The challenge was always in implementation and the trade-offs involved. So what's she going to do? It isn't obvious. The final dimension of this is that whilst in theory she has a relatively blank slate in terms of a mandate, in reality the simple lack of Tory MPs, the relative smallness of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, I think is going to be a really limiting factor for her, because with only 121 MPs and some of those having ruled out serving, she's already going to have to double up some people to fill all of the shadow roles, and she will be very ill-positioned to withstand resignations. So that means that actually the people that she decides to put in her shadow cabinet over the next few days should end up having a remarkable degree of influence over what policy is in their area. And again, that means that she may end up being much more constricted than it initially appears, and much more, in the end, in the position that Rishi Sunak found himself in, where, in order to maintain Conservative Party unity, he ended up having to do not very much of anything, because there were very few things, at least on the big questions, upon which the Conservative Party was actually agreed.
I think another thing with her is the temper. She's quite sharp. Now, don't get me wrong, I think this is a virtue for many a woman politician. You need to be sharp-elbowed. But we have seen her look and get quite frustrated in media interviews. And I can imagine her rattling people and rubbing them up the wrong way, if that is a character trait that is deployed in work as well as. I mean,
maybe that's something she can. Maybe that's something she can work on and unlearn a little bit and train out of her. Good politicians do improve areas of weakness, but you're right. There is something about her manner that feels, every time she articulates something, as if she's explaining it for the third time to someone she considers stupid.
Yeah.
A lot of people might see it as strength and conviction and sort of knowing herself. But I think it has the potential to get very old very quickly.
Well, I guess, Alex, we'll see a reshuffle happening over the next few days. We'll get to understand better the flavour and shape of the opposition she wants to lead, and that will give us some more clues as to her initial direction of travel with it. We have had a couple of days now to digest and ruminate on the budget. I've definitely developed my thoughts on it since we recorded the main show on Thursday. How are you feeling about it all?
I mean, it was interesting, again, in terms of media reaction, the glee with which so many people jumped on really quite a slight market movement in both 10-year gilt yields and also a drop of the pound. The pound moves after budgets. And actually, the pound going down is not necessarily a bad thing for the economy. It's a very, very complex second-order effect. In any case, both the gilts have then the next day went down slightly and the pound went up slightly and stabilized. It never looked like a panic, like the sort of reaction that came after the Truss budget. It looked like a price adjustment, which was completely expected. If you cast your mind back to what Vicky Pryce was saying, it was a government saying, we want to borrow quite a lot of money. And the market going, okay, it's going to cost you this much. I mean, but like I said, I think the glee with which everyone jumped on, oh, is this going to be another disaster? I mean, it was incredible. I found it really quite demoralizing just how many people were actively rooting for the first budget of a Labour government to fail. And how then the fact that markets stabilized went almost completely unremarked on, with a notable exception of the always straight down the line Ed Conway, in my view. You know, we've talked about it many times before. The media seem to be acting like crack addicts, just looking for their next high. And it really is beginning to grate on me.
Well, my thoughts are, there's some policy thoughts in there, but I'll come to those. My more sort of substantive point. This was a Brexit tax budget, right? What do I mean by that? We are paying the price of Brexit in no small part through this budget. But because of the tightrope Labour is walking on Brexit Europe, they aren't going to say that. They aren't going to come out and say, our inheritance is, in no small part, this absolutely dreadful Brexit deal, which has added 140 billion in cost so far.
Well, I mean, they said it. She said it at the opening of her speech, and then never came back to it or proposed anything to do.
Indeed. So I'll come to that, and we must also talk about your brilliant podcast you've done with Jacob Erberg that's come out this weekend as well on the EU reset. But Best of Britain has done a page, the cost of Brexit. It's brilliant. Go and have a look at it, everybody. It's a really handy way to see all the different costs that have been proven to have been attached.
We'll drop a link, of course.
We'll drop a link. But Brexit has contributed in no small part to the stagnation of our economy. And this budget was having to rectify some of that. I think Labour has done a good job of saying, hey guys, we inherited a 22 billion black hole. This is a mess we inherited. But they've not quite got on top of the narrative that is now coming from the right, which is, oh, this is a socialist budget. Look, this is what you get with Labour, blah, 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 blah. If we cast our minds back to 2010, Osborne pursued austerity under the very dishonest claim that Tina, there is no alternative because of the financial crisis, because of the state of the economy Labour left us. He did not pursue austerity because of that. It was an ideologically driven budget. Far more so than this one is driven ideologically by socialism. In fact, his budget was driven by the very market fundamentalism that brought us a fucking financial crisis in the first fucking place. But they are clever and the spin work. They are good at politics. They are good at spin. Labour needs to get far, far, far better at it because we haven't heard their equivalent of that with this budget, which would actually be true as opposed to grossly dishonest. So I think that's kind of over the last 48 hours where my head has gone, and probably no surprise to anyone because Brexit is what I live and breathe as my day job. On the detail of stuff, I suppose there are things that I was initially upset about. We talked about on the main show the transport budget being cut in real terms. I was disappointed, but on reflection, I actually think, no, let's renationalise it all first before we pump money in. Better value for money for the taxpayer. I actually don't really want them to be pumping money into failing infrastructure that will now go into the pockets of privatised companies or another nation state that owns our infrastructure.
And interestingly, part of the reason why the Transport Department's budget shrunk, I found out since then, was the fact that they are cutting the subsidies that they're giving to rail companies. So it's interesting, yeah.
Indeed. I think that they could and should have increased taxes in a more progressive way. I have made a pitch on the show before to do a standalone podcast on land value taxation. I have had a grand total of one listener say that they would like to hear that. So far, I'm not teeing it up, but if people want to hear more about it, I will gladly do that. That would be a pipe dream, would take time to implement and ideally transition. But
can I tell you, though, you talk about the comms operation for Labour. You go on our brilliant Discord channel and pitch that as a special episode on wealth tax, and you'll get about 100 people.
True.
Thumbs upping
So
it.
sticking with wealth tax, I think they should have equalised the tax relief on pension contributions because I don't think there is much social benefit gained from turning comfortable pensioners into rich ones. And I think moving to a flat 20% relief would save the Exchequer in the order of about 13 billion a year, and I think would have landed better than some. They probably didn't because they'd already done winter fuel allowance, or maybe for whatever reason that was never really on their radar. But that would have been something that I would like to have seen. And beyond that, I like the National Wealth Fund. I think it's going to operate quite like an investment bank. It's going to support the economy's green transition. I think it's very worthy to try and help make that transition pay for people. But I didn't see it as constituted as primarily maximising growth. So, look, it was definitely better than what we had. It was a budget we needed to have. I just would love there to be a bit more obvious growth benefit from it. And I think some of the progressive taxation stuff was tricks missed. But more than anything, we all need to take it upon ourselves to push this narrative that this is a Brexit tax budget. The Lib Dems aren't going to say it and the Greens aren't going to say it because even though they know it, why should they help Labour out on this? They are, after all, political opponents. So for those of us that care deeply about the damage that Brexit has done to our economy, I think we need to help Labour out a bit and say what they won't say or can't say, which is, you don't like this? Well, blame those that brought us Brexit.
3 short things in response. The first is that I think Labour need to basically clone Darren Jones so that he can be on all channels at all times.
He's still my beating heart. Can I just say, I called him early on. I have often said that the right of Labour should be looking at him as the next leader. or, leader in waiting if they want to have a woman before that, because wouldn't that be great? But he is brilliant. And Darren, if you're listening, I hope you're getting some sleep this weekend, because you were clearly awake for about 72 hours this week, just non-stop.
Right. So that's one just cheeky thought on the side. The second thought is that, yes, there are obvious areas of progressive taxation, but I'm not sure they were missed. I think a chancellor looking at 9 more fiscal events ahead, she has to leave herself some stuff to tax in the future as well, right?
Yep.
So maybe fuel tax will be in a year's time, and maybe they will equalize the pension in March. Who knows? The last thing I would say, and that goes back to what you were saying about the austerity legacy of the Osborne years and how dishonestly but brilliantly they communicated that fairy tale. There is a secondary consequence of that which really bugs me, and that is because at that time there was a really honourable school of thought that said we need to borrow money to pump it into the economy, to make it grow, etc., etc. There was a lot of modern monetary theory going around. There was a lot of spurs for money creation, etc., etc. That has stayed with people, and they're now applying it to an environment that is A, more inflationary, and B, the markets are more volatile. And I am a big proponent of MMT, but the reason that argument applied to the hilt when Osborne was Chancellor was because it was super, super cheap to borrow money or to create money, actually, because it was a very low inflationary environment. If anything, the risk was deflation at one point.
Yep.
So the same thing that applied then does not apply now.
But it won't
the
stop
logic
the
of it,
people coming at you in the comments.
The logic of it holds. But in order to get there, you have to come out of the cycle where any intervention makes inflation go up and be on the downward spiral, basically, of inflation. And you have to get the markets to trust you. A Labour government coming in with its first budget, an inflationary environment and a suspicious market, doing loads of money creation would have been a Liz Truss moment. I just want to make that clear because I think people get it in their heads that MMT is the answer to everything, and it's just not.
No. And that's not to say that some of the things we saw in the budget won't be inflationary. I think the improved public sector pay stuff will push up wages more generally across the board, but could also have a bit of an uptick in inflation as a consequence. I mean, I thought they were going to borrow extra to invest in more transport and energy, communication infrastructure, housing. Instead, it's more like pumping money into health and education capital spending. They needed to. These buildings are literally falling down. So, welcome. But we've got a big backlog in health and education capital projects, which means it's not quite the growth budget yet. But as you say, many more fiscal events yet to come. And hopefully we'll see some more of that in the future. I just hope that what we're doing in parallel to this is deeply thinking about our trading relationship with Europe and reducing those barriers, because you will get some growth from that. And boy, do we need it.
Do listen to that
I was just about to give you a segue on that. I listened to it this morning, hoovered it up. So this was a short show that Alex did with Professor Jacob Oberg, and they do a really good deep dive on the UK EU reset, touching on the politics within member states, in Brussels, what that might mean for us here in the UK, what is the art of the possible. Can you flippantly just talk about a veterinary agreement without understanding that that's actually really quite a difficult thing to do? It's worth your while. You'll learn a lot. Please do go and hoover that episode up.
There's basically a lot that Labour can do that consists of small incremental steps. But at the moment, that just isn't the focus. Jacob used an expression that I absolutely loved. He said, if you just do things with your left hand, not much is going to happen. And I do think that is actually quite a good way to describe what is going on with this blasted UK-EU reset at the moment. The government is trying to do a little bit of it with its left hand, unnoticed, and while it's doing loads of other stuff. And it just doesn't work like that. They have to put a team in place that is completely focused on that renegotiation.
And that was my line that I put out after we heard the news that Badenoch had won the Tory leadership contest. It was like, right, they're distracted. There's a lot of internal stuff for them to do and focus on rebuild. While they are distracted, please go and properly reset that relationship, because this is a moment to do it. Quiet, Riot. Now, I mentioned it at the top of the show. We need a bit of therapy. Alex, my anxiety is through the roof. We have T-minus, 72 hours from the time of recording till polling stations open in America. Huge numbers of early voting, of course, have already happened. Very little movement in the polls still. The economist aggregator that does the Monte Carlo statistical analysis, which is where you rerun with slightly tweaked variables, it tells you how many times Harris wins, how many times Trump wins. When we were going in to record, it was 51 times out of 100 he won, 48 times out of 100 she wins.
And one, it was a draw.
Well, I know, and I think it may have been Owen Winter I saw it said, if you toss a coin, actually you get a greater difference than 50-50.
Yeah.
So the polls are simply not giving us anything at all. You've got views on this?
I think the polls are misreading this election, and I don't know which way, which is infuriating. But I do think that when the result comes in, it will be clear one way or the other. Actually, when I read that newsletter by Nate Silver, it was a real light bulb moment, because I thought, yes, that's why my gut is telling me.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people adjusting in order not to get slated afterwards for being too far out one way or the other. And so everyone is going, ooh, it's 50-50. And they sample 800 voters in this state, and they sample 3,000 voters in that state, and, they do it online. And somehow the result always comes back 49-51, 48-52. And it's like, actually, if you honestly reported on your polls, you wouldn't see that.
No.
You would see a lot more outlying polls.
Of course you would. Of course you would.
So they're all going, oh, let's go with a safe thing. And I don't think it's reflective.
I was trying to think, okay, Naomi, if the polls aren't telling us anything at all, when will we actually know? So there will be exit polls, and they usually come out at 5 p.m. Eastern time. The US changes its clocks a week after us, so they're changing tonight as we record this, so they would have changed by the time you listen tomorrow, meaning they are 5 hours behind. So it should be 10 p.m. UK time when we get exit polls. At this point, they're not permitted to project a winner while voting is still taking place. Mm-hmm. So they'll only be announced in states where the margins are large enough, and they won't be used in battleground states to project whether Harris or Trump has won. And what the statisticians do is they use a combination of the exit poll and actual declared votes and some other data to forecast a winner.
I mean, no one is going to declare, I think, early on this one. Trump is not going to concede. He still hasn't conceded fucking 2020.
Yeah.
But I hope that Harris doesn't concede until we have a lot of information. I hope she doesn't do basically an Al Gore.
Right. So in 2000, this was Gore W. Polling day was November the 7th, I think, but we didn't find out until December the 12th, and that was a Florida kind of automatic recount and went all the way to the Supreme Court, and then Gore conceded. But
Gore conceded on the night, that's the point.
Yeah.
And by that time, I think the narrative had ebbed away, and everyone thought of George W. as the winner and the legal action as sour grapes. And it turns out that actually there was quite a lot of jiggery-pokery going on, because Jeb Bush was governor of Florida. So his brother was kind of controlling the rules of the vote. And I have read, not insignificant essays, by far not by people who are prone to conspiracies, etc., that result could genuinely have gone either way, that there were big problems with the vote in Florida that the Democrats could have attacked and should have attacked had Gore not conceded. So I hope she doesn't do that. I hope every last vote is counted because, again, you might remember in Florida, they had to literally wait for the absentee ballots to come in by mail and count them. It was that close.
Well, I was thinking then about the 76 days between Election Day and Inauguration Day to understand the process a bit better and try and give listeners a bit more insight into that. And largely because if Trump doesn't overwhelmingly win very, very obviously on the night, how bad it could get. And what is there to look out for in terms of what we saw on January 6, 2021? What are the pitfalls in the run-up to January 2025 that could be particularly dangerous? By one estimate, there are more than 10,000 jurisdictions that dictate the election processes. So you've got the local level, county level, state level, and then each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia have their separate legal requirements for presidential elections, and then Congress gets involved. And I'm going to leave a link in the show notes to more on this, but a really basic summary of the dates and the risks associated with them are, obviously, polling day itself will see a spike in disinformation relating to in-person voting, including where polling stations are located, that they may have closed, so don't bother turning up, voting equipment, voting requirements. You're going to see confusion, maybe, and administrative mistakes relating to the voting processes, which might trigger allegations of fraud. Why? Why is this a risk? Well, there has been an absolutely enormous turnover in the number of election workers due to the unrelenting threats and harassment from election deniers at the last election. And new election workers just don't have prior actual experience to lean on. Then between polling day and the 11th of December, you have the canvassing or tabulation at the county level, and then certification by the officials. And then once they all get certified, it all gets processed. Some states like Arizona permit mail ballots to be processed on receipt or on a designated date before election day. Other states like Pennsylvania, the biggie, do not allow processing until election day. So we'll get slower to release unofficial results and faster to release official results depending on which date you're looking at. And during this period, we could see impressions of a red wave until, as you quite rightly say, every vote is counted and all of those mail-in ballots have been counted. But you're going to see claims of victory before a sufficient number of ballots are counted that allow for the race to actually be called. Probably much more misinformation being spread around by different news outlets and their projections, delays.
And Twitter, of course.
And then you've got Safe Harbor Day, and that's the 11th of December, and that's the deadline for states to have resolved any electoral college disputes. Then I think we're into the really, really dangerous position in the run-up to and including Inauguration Day on January 20th, which could see a repeat or worse in terms of the rise in threats and violence than we had in 2021. So I don't think we're in for a great time no matter what happens next week. And my God, please, can everyone just not listen to Greta Thunberg and actually do go out and vote for Harris? Did you see her tweet, Alex?
No.
So last night I spotted
did she do a Susan Sarandon?
Do you know what? It felt more like Russell Brand about 10 years ago when he told people there's no point in voting. It was, look, there's clearly a monster who's even worse than the other monster, but she's still a monster because of Palestine. And there is nothing feminist in overseeing genocide. And it was very politically naive. It was very self-indulgent. A few years ago, I wouldn't publicly criticise her because she was incredibly young. I don't think she is that young anymore. I mean, she's still very young, but she is an adult. And she is far more experienced in this political world. I thought it was a deeply, deeply unhelpful thing to do, given the clout she probably has with a lot of young Americans who we do need to turn out and vote Harris.
Yeah, Susan Sarandon, 2016, same kind of shtick. And then, a few years later, Roe v. Wade, gone. And the Supreme Court stacked with Trumpsters for the next however many years. So the idea that they're all the same and neither of them can make a difference, I think that's really a profoundly misguided notion. and women in America are paying for that.
Quiet Riot.
I guess what I want to tell listeners is we need to prepare ourselves, I think, psychologically. We need to make psychological space for the possibility of a Kamala Harris victory, for the possibility of a Donald Trump victory, and for the possibility that it might be so close that we're in limbo for ages. And I think it's better to rearrange your thoughts when it's still just a concept and prepare yourself ahead of time. I'm not counseling despair, quite the opposite, actually, because I think because it's so close and because it's so complicated, I think a lot of people have convinced themselves that Trump is going to win in order to be pleasantly surprised if he doesn't. I think that's actually quite damaging, because I think you're making yourself very miserable and very anxious right now for something that might never happen. Also, you just don't know how things shake out, ever. In that conversation I had with Jacob Oberg, he was telling me that a Trump victory in the States might be the best possible scenario for an EU-UK rekindling of relations, sort of hugging closer to each other, because it will basically shoot defence up the agenda, and defence is where the UK has the most to offer to the EU. And
it
so,
might make the French pipe down about fish, which is the fishing quotas is genuinely the big thing that could hold everything up once again. So I agree. I think there is some optimism if there is a Trump presidency that quite clearly the UK doesn't want to find itself friendless, bobbing around mid-Atlantic, and would want to tether itself back to Europe, and Europe would need us to.
In any case, what I wanted to say was prepare yourself for all three of those possibilities in a calm and rational way, understanding that you don't know the second and third order effects of any of those possible outcomes, and also knowing that progress is not an easy thing. It's a process of small banked victories and often involves a lot of backsliding before you eventually make more progress. And so the long arc of history is moving in a positive direction. And there is some comfort in that. And that's it for this week's Quiet Riot Sunday School.
Don't forget you can follow us on social media, including Blue Sky, at Quiet Riot Pod, or email us on quietriotpod@gmail.com.
And if you value our work, please support our work on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. We have an amazing panel for you next week, reacting to the result, maybe, of that election. We're doing it jointly with Best for Britain and live casting it on video. You get to see us in the flesh. And our panel is nothing less than stellar, let me tell you. So watch out for that. Final thing, our thoughts are with friends and family of Janie Godley. She was a funny woman, and her voiceover videos were a real feature of my lockdown, as I know they were for many. She was funny to the very, very end, and she's gone now.
Sleep well.
Bon voyage, Janie.
Thank you for listening, and we'll be back, as Alex says, with a US election fallout special. Stay brave, stay calm, and remember that no matter the result, Quiet Riot will be here for you. Lots of love. Bye. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads, with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreou and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet Riot. Nigel Farage, what are you doing here?
Yeah, well, I'm over here for my pal Trump. I don't know if you know, but somebody tried to shoot a hole in his ear and that. And I'm here because me and Trump, we've been absolute best pals.
Did he ask you to come?
No, he doesn't even know I'm here. I mean, I've been shouting up at his window and that.
I thought you were giving all your time to Clacton now as its newest MP.
Clacton? Oh, yeah, Clacton, that's right. I'm the MP for Clacton. No, I decided other people can keep a wee eye to Clacton for me and that, and everybody else can just deal with that. I had to come here and see my pal Trump.
Just tell us one thing. Have you seen Liz Truss here?
No, I saw a woman hanging about the salad bar, getting stuck right into the lettuce. And I went, that's probably Liz Truss. Also, Boris is here. But nah, no fucking interest in seeing them.